Hello, and welcome to Reclamation, a Naomi Wright Ministries initiative. I am Naomi, and this is going to be the first part of the final part of my story project. I listened back through this morning before allowing the recording to go live, and I am going to admit that I teared up at the end. It was a lot to take in all at once, and I felt overwhelmed by the information and the memories and an emotional combination of grief, relief, and gratitude. I say this because for those of you who are listening, you may unsuspectingly find yourself being triggered by one or more aspects of this conversation. Please pause when you need to. Please take Amber and I up on some of the tips we share. Grab a blanket, a hot or cold beverage, take a walk, and take a break. This is to serve you and not to harm you, so please use this information accordingly. I want to share a little bit about Amber. She and I met at the University of Michigan. We were both in their Advanced Standing Masters of Social Work program, and before the start of the fall semester, they required us to participate in a volunteer day, and we had both signed up to paint a room at what I believe was a child advocacy center. It's been like 14 years, so I may have that wrong. But we painted the room this incredibly bold blue that we did not choose. It was not our fault, but oh my goodness, it was a very small room and a very blue. And I can still see it with my eyes open, actually. Amber went on to complete her degree at U of M. I withdrew pretty quickly, just a couple weeks in, because of the death of my father. And then I ended up finishing that degree elsewhere at a later time. So this means that she has her master's from what was at the time anyway, the #1 school in the country for her degree. And I just get to brag on her for a minute because that is a huge accomplishment. And it's possible that U of M is still the #1 school in the country for a master's of social work. I'm just not sure. I haven't kept up on it. Amber now has her LCSW, which means she's a licensed clinical social worker. So that means she did a bunch of other things in order to be at that level. It's the highest level for a social worker. She has that recognition in both Illinois and Washington, and she runs her own very successful private practice in those states. I will link her contact info in the show notes, as well as a couple of other resources that may be helpful to you. While this conversation stays more in the clinical realm overall, please walk away from this episode with zero doubt about God's presence in my life. Without His kindness, love, grace, and faithfulness to bringing these issues to the surface and in continuing to encourage me forward, I don't know that I would be here. Minimally, without question, I would not be where I am right now. I have never truly been left without a parent to turn to. Without further ado, welcome to part 1 of the final part of my story project on mental health. Please be aware that this episode does contain some mature sexual content and one use of profanity. My apologies. Listener discretion is advised. I was thinking through who would be a great fit for this conversation, and it's important to me that I have conversations, not only for my own self, but for modeling for other people as well, that I have these types of conversations with someone who I know is safe, who knows something about me or cares about me, or is at least a caring individual who feels safe. Like if I went to find a support professional out of out off of Google, so okay, I'm having a 15-minute consult and I'm seeing what is that chemistry between us? Does this seem like a safe person to sit down and have a conversation with? And odds are they are a safe person, but for some reason it may not feel that way for me. And so I wanted to approach this sharing of my story in that same way and make sure that I was being kind to myself and gentle with myself and putting this information out there. And with some of these areas, I also really need someone who understands the content I'm talking about, because I want them to be able to respond and be able to give some educational components. And it just had to be you.
That is such an honor.
Because you're all of that in one. You have the education, the experience, the information to share, as well as a loving, kind, gentle, caring presence. And on top of that, we've known each other for like 15 years now.
Right.
So that's just a huge bonus.
So we have the relationship to boot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being willing to do this. And especially, we're in her home right now. It is beautiful. It's the first time I'm in her new home, which is exciting. So to host us and all of that as well on top of it is just a huge gift. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I'm going to hand it over to you. So for those listening, this is part 5 of 5 of the Naomi Story Project. So this is the last part of my story. And we are going to be talking about the mental health component of my journey. And Amber is going to be the interviewer. So I'm going to hand that over to you and answer your questions.
Well, thank you. First and foremost, for trusting me with this journey and this portion of your journey, and for thinking of me in all of those really lovely ways. So I'm honored to host you and have you and be your friend and be your advocate, and also to be part of this journey of sharing, spreading the word. Truly, it means a lot to me to have voiceless and sometimes really private things be heard in a space where others can feel like their experiences matter and that people care, and there's kindness and there's compassion and there's expertise in that space where you need it, and that people can find it. It's available.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, and maybe in unsuspecting places. And yeah, I'm excited for people to hear this conversation. So the mental health component of your journey, I want to honor how hard it's been for you. I want to give validation and room and space for the experiences you've had, and let people know that there's hope, that you can get through so much trauma and grief and personal struggles, and you can be better for it. And I'm honored. I want to start with depression. And you describe for yourself having had a deep depression emerging throughout your healing process. And at times it was better, and at times it was worse. And there were moments where you even had suicidal thoughts. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit and walk us through your experience of depression.
Certainly. Depression for me has been odd because I never stayed there for an extended period of time at one time. But as I would take different losses and realize that my worldview was a complete fallacy, and the reality of what that meant, of who people I loved were, the truth of their message, and the losses that accompanied that, I would have times of feeling very hopeless and having no idea I couldn't even imagine what a next step would be. They were such paralyzing moments in the beginning. And so it wasn't even, well, what do I do now? It was more of, how do I absorb what is now? And in those moments, I could just feel suffocated by the weight. And so the depression during those time frames was a very heavy feeling, like having a very weighted blanket on top of me. And that would be maybe a longer period of time, but I didn't have a persistent depression for months on end. I could feel happy, I could take a break and enjoy time with friends. And a part of that was how genuine it was or not would be up for debate, but I had very much learned to sort of compartmentalize And so I still needed to function in society. And so I could do that. But I still had something else I was carrying around inside of me.
Right.
The pro of that, because it wasn't a complete separation, but the pro of that was I really was able to take a break. Even though I was aware I'm going through this, I can have to go to class or whatever it may be, and I can laugh with a friend. Mm-hmm. And that really did prove to be very healthy for me. As I came through this process more, the depression presented in a different way. And that's really where the suicidal thoughts would come in. And even looking back, it was really interesting how, and you might be able to shed some light on this, so no pressure. I would have moments of just very quickly becoming overwhelmed and just thinking, there's no hope for this. I can't handle it. I need out.
Right.
And if you compared what happened in that moment versus what I had already lived through, you would just a logical layman thought would be, I should have thought that then. This is so not a big deal in comparison.
Right.
But I just really quickly would just be like, I can't, and feel like I was going over the edge and it was hopeless. And so that is what followed next. I have been removed from all of that, I would say, for a couple of years now. And those overwhelmed moments, they almost came in seasons of just a lot of transition, a lot of things kind of being up in the air. And it seemed to re-trigger that previous feeling, right, even though that situation didn't actually warrant it in reality.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense, actually. You're in survival mode. Mm-hmm. And then through the healing process, it's safe enough, literally safe enough to think the thoughts mm-hmm. that you're thinking, mm-hmm. to have them delayed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I had a catch in those moments of this is going to be temporary. And I knew that. And for me, that's very spiritual. I believe that God was with me in that. And I would have this very polarizing feeling of almost lightness that went along with that weight and that darkness. I just knew that if I was willing to be present with it and not try to stuff it away, mm-hmm. ignore it, act like it wasn't happening, if I was willing to be present with it and go through the process, I would come through the process. And I just knew that with every part of me. It wasn't just a cognitive thought. I knew it in my heart and my soul that it would be temporary.
Yeah. Which definitely helped get you through.
Oh, 100%. I cannot imagine how I would have come through without that.
Yeah. The escape was really alluring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you knew you could.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew I could. I knew that sunshine was real. I could feel it on my skin when I went outside.
Yeah.
I knew that laughter was authentic. And I still knew that love was real. I knew that truth was a real thing. I just didn't know what it was. So I knew all of these things. I just had to go find it again.
Yeah, very powerful. Yeah, your experience of depression, to normalize it a little bit for you and mm-hmm. for any listener, to feel heaviness, to feel a physical sensation of depression, to feel hopelessness, to feel lost, to feel like an escape is alluring, to feel, any combination of those and more, because each person is unique, is, very normal. And also to have experienced it in a delayed fashion when accompanied with trauma, which we'll get to. Mm-hmm. It's literally a mechanism for your brain and body to say, it's not safe yet to even explore this. We are numbing it completely out. And for it to show up at a time in your life when it doesn't quite make so much sense to show up, that is how we operate. Mm-hmm. That's how our bodies and brains keep us going. Mm-hmm. When the hope was present, you could feel so hopeless because you had something else there to keep you good and safe and moving through your healing. Mm-hmm. So with trauma as a component, with depression, through depression, it's a big word. And I think it deserves a little attention on what trauma means versus what a clinical diagnosis of PTSD means. So if it's okay, I will just go ahead and explore that a little bit.
I think that's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's clarify those two.
So trauma is something that 8 out of 100 people experience. It is more common probably than that, but our studies do not include likely every scenario of trauma just because they're not recorded or discussed. So my clinical hat being on and off for this comment, I think that's a very low number. But trauma is an emotional response to a terrifying event that's like an accident or a natural disaster or an abuse situation. And typically with a trauma, there's initial denial and shock. Our body is protective of us. And typically with a trauma, over time, months, years, we explore it more. There are longer term reactions like unpredictable emotional responses, flashbacks, maybe strained relationships, or physical symptoms. PTSD, though, is different. PTSD is saying, we're going to take it a step further. It's a clinical diagnosis. So a trauma is a universal response to a terrifying event. And PTSD says there are complications here that you're likely going to need some attention or assistance, support to get through, because doing it on your own would probably be the harder path. So PTSD is diagnosed as a psychiatric disorder for someone who has experienced a traumatic event with an overwhelming experience that persisted long after the event. And there's 4 components there of intrusion, which is I'm believing things that are really difficult to tackle on my own. Intrusion of flashbacks, intrusion of dreams, avoidant behaviors, such as I can't be anywhere near a person that was involved in my trauma. I can't be in a car if it was a car accident. I can't be in a town if it happened in a town. So avoiding location and people. The 3rd aspect is alteration in cognition and mood. So feeling depressed, panicked, experiencing shame or guilt or self-blame that you're somehow responsible for the event, even if that is not reality. And alteration in arousal and reactivity, which is such an interesting component because it really builds and brings in the body, the mind, and the spirit connection for me. It says that fight, flight, or freeze response is 1000% connected to your trauma response. They can't really be taken apart. They are interwoven together. So fight, flight, or freeze gets some, not a bad rap, but I think it gets not seen in its fullest. So fight or flight is one level of danger. Our body goes into sympathetic nervous system shock. So either I want to respond to protect myself with force, or I want to respond to protect myself with distance or with worry. But freeze is actually another level. It's a parasympathetic response. It's immobility. I protect myself with numbing out, immobility, dissociation, depersonalization, not being present. It's preparing for death. It's the next level. So I think that gets misunderstood a little bit because fight or flight is so normal. We go into fight or flight when we see the curtains moving and we think someone's breaking in. Oh, no, it's just the cat behind the curtain, right? Like we go into that sympathetic nervous system response that's so vital to life.
I'm smiling because I'm like, people go into fight or flight on Black Friday when they're like outside in line and they want the deal.
Yes, that's fight or flight.
Yeah. I'm like, I gotta get it.
It's so normal. It's a normal response. But when we elevate it to that point where we're frozen, that is where PTSD gets diagnosed. In my humble opinion, though that's not always what happens in real life, that's the difference between a trauma where we go into that elevated level, but we're able to regulate, come back down, self-soothe, when we get to a level where it's diagnosable as PTSD, we have hit freeze. So saying all of that, I'm curious about your reactions maybe to some things I've said and your own personal response and experience of trauma and likely PTSD.
Yes. So I had when was this? This was, I can't think of exactly when at this point, but it was just like maybe 2 to 3 years ago. I discovered through a conversation with a new therapist. So I've been meeting with someone for 2-3 years that Michael and I love. He's a great fit for both of us, and it's a wonderful fit. And I recommend this to anyone who's searching, who is married, if this would be appropriate for their personal dynamic in their family. But it's worked out great because he's a great fit for both of us individually in a session or together. Now, of course, with boundaries and proper ethics, he will only see us together. But that's been wonderful for us because if Michael's struggling or if I'm struggling, the other is still present. And so we're still able to be present for one another and also be more equipped, like, how do I help during this time? So it's been a huge gift for our family and a huge find to have that.
Yes.
And I had certain things come up in relation to my upbringing. He wanted to try referring me to someone for some one-on-one to see if that would be more beneficial. And so it was in this process. And sorry, I say all of that because I always want to encourage people to seek a support professional.
Oh,
so
yes.
Just giving that as kind of like a tidbit of something to think about. If you do have a significant other, you might want to consider meeting with them if that would be healthy for your dynamic. But I was referred to someone else. It didn't end up being a good fit. And I want to share this too, because sometimes it's not. I felt, whether it was true or not, I felt more like I was interesting to this person. Like my story was just fascinating. And so it wasn't serving me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, those are a lot of, I'm having a panicked reaction to that. Yes, that is a place and a moment for you to reflect and say, this is not the best fit for me.
Yeah. So I went 2 or 3 times and then called it. I was like, this isn't serving me. He can read my book when it comes out if he wants it. I'll send him a free signed copy because I get it. It is interesting, but that's not the time or place for it.
No.
So, but he brought to my attention that it's not normal to see yourself in your memories. And I had never heard that before. And that was very alarming for me because I couldn't think of a memory at the time where I did not see myself growing up.
Yes.
And then through significant periods of my 20s as well, as I was going through the trauma of losing both parents and having believed they could not die, that was an incredibly complicated grief. And so it would carry over because I'm in this traumatized state. I'm in this state of shock, but yet I'm still finishing my master's degree and interacting with people. And so I was dissociating a lot of the time. And the diagnosis I was given was depersonalization.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him saying that if you can see yourself in your memory, that's an indicator that you were in a dissociative state at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that was almost perpetual. And what had triggered this conversation was that my husband had started working part-time for a church. And with that commitment, I, as his wife, also had certain unspoken expectations to just be around and be at things and things that I wanted to do anyway, but the expectation that I do it sent me over the edge.
Yes.
I went off a cliff I didn't know I was standing next to. And I was depersonalized for just chunks of time, and I couldn't get it under control. So it was as if like the lid had blown off. And fortunately, I was rooted enough in life in general and having, worked through other things and also my educational background to know the lid has blown off. This is a scary place to be. I have to seek help immediately. We have to get this under control. And I also really believed it could get under control.
Yeah.
But it was days at a time. And I'm like, this feels borderline psychotic break. Like I feel, and I knew it could be. I was like, I could land up somewhere for a hold. Like this is not safe. And unfortunately, I have an incredibly supportive husband too, who hears me when I say, I'm not just giving you a hard time. I can't do this.
Yes.
I mean, I'm standing in church. At one point, I'm at the back of the church on the floor, hysterically crying.
Wow.
And I would try to stand there with him, and I would have this visual, almost real enough that it's as if my eyes are open and I can see it, even though I didn't. But it was just that vivid of me running out of the building and running down the street and ripping my skin off. Not just my clothes, but like ripping my skin off so that I could be free.
Yes.
So it was to that degree. And that was the worst of it, for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
And had incredible support by the professional that we still see, because what I was able to do and what I learned to do, which was kind of a survival trick on my part and a significant macro level goal of Naomi Wright Ministries, is for other people not to have to do this. But I was fortunately clever enough and resourceful enough to say, let's forget the context, let's focus on the issue. Nobody knows what to do with my context. I don't care. This is the issue, and you know what to do with this issue.
Yes.
So let's just forget about the rest of it. You know what to do with depersonalization. Help me.
Yes.
And I was able to get that help. And so I learned how to slow it down and catch the start of that feeling, and read some great literature. I mean, I came from a trauma-informed master's program.
Right.
And understood what happens in the brain and the way it's, been chemically wired and routed from the trauma as a child, and, updated myself on some of that information as well, and was able to start that process of, okay, I can feel that starting, because it did feel like a fight or flight initially before it would throw into a freeze. Like I would feel that first. And so I started to be able to catch that and honor it, instead of doing what I had been raised to do, which was you push yourself, you pull yourself, you do what you're supposed to do anyway. And that's what it was in my household. And so I started to actually be kind and be gentle and say that I'm starting to feel it, and that means I need to back away because this is unsafe.
Yes.
And my husband needed to hear that too. Not like he ever wanted to push too far, but he would push too far. He would push me into that state because he didn't understand what he was doing. He thought he was helping.
Yes, of course.
And of course he's getting it wrong because he hasn't had the support to know how to do it well. So it was huge for us to be in those appointments together.
Yes.
And I went as far as, there were moments, Amber, where I didn't have a weighted blanket, and I would feel like I was leaving my body. And I literally was like, Michael, he's 200 pounds. I hope he doesn't mind. He's 6 foot. So it's not like he's, 5'11" or, 5'5" and 200 pounds. But I was like, I need you to sit on me.
Yeah.
I literally would have this man sit on my lap to keep me in my body and maintain my sensation of being attached to a body.
Yes. Great. I'm glad that we can talk about this so openly, your own experience, and then I can validate all of that. So from a clinical point of view, dissociation includes depersonalization, feeling like you need to rip your skin off, feeling like you're not yourself, feeling like you need to be free of something. This idea that you're watching yourself as if you're not you. Right? So memories where you can see yourself versus out of your own two eyes. Dissociation is a detachment in general, right? So that's what it means. To dissociate means to detach. So when we're talking about this in a clinical sense, we mean detachment from my personhood, my body, my thoughts, my emotional content, my memories, a sense of lost, and scared lost, if that makes any sense. Urgent lost. And so what you're talking about, how that worked for you, like what helped to quiet, to slow, to breathe, to have sensations that are physical, the grounding sensations cannot be understated. They are necessary for anyone experiencing trauma in general, but dissociation in particular, You need to shower, walk, lay in the grass, feel sunlight, swim. You need a sensation. If you can't have anything else, a cold glass of water. Cold, hot, water, weight, a weighted blanket, someone sitting on you, holding a pet, holding a child, anything that feels like a physical change. But not just a physical change, a grounding is one of the most universal experiences of helping yourself through a dissociative either episode or state. So thank you for sharing your experience of just what you needed and leaning in.
Yeah, that was an incredibly difficult time. And a promise I made to my husband during that time was, I have to back away from the things that are triggering this right now, but you've known me long enough to know that I won't stay here. I won't stay in this place. I will do the hard work that is necessary to be somewhere else.
Yes.
In time. So I will do that hard work. So I promise you that. But for right now, this is what I have to do because it's just too out of control. And again, our therapist helped with that of saying it's actually dangerous to continue to allow yourself to be pushed into that state. And so, yeah, you need to back away from it. But yeah, I remember at times even taking socks off and being like, I need to feel the ground. And it's because of that feeling of floating away. And it's like I needed to maintain that feeling of connection to myself. And I don't know, I don't know why this is the case for me, but I'm so thankful for it. I don't believe it's necessarily everyone's story. We all have our own nuances to our story. Thankfully, we have these overlaps where we can also understand and have empathy and compassion for one another, but there's nuances as well. Something that has been a huge gift in my story that I'm thankful for is when something has come to the surface for me and I've had the choice to either embrace the process or to not. When I have said, yes, I'm going to embrace this process, I have come through things very quickly overall. And I'm very thankful for that. So within a few months, this wasn't happening. It was happening. I mean, it went down to like a couple times a month. And then I would say it's been about a year and a half since the really strong episodes. And I think, or since, I got it under control, because I was reflecting on this with someone recently. And I think in that year and a half, I can remember twice where I started to dissociate. And here was the interesting thing. I knew it was happening and it had started to happen. So like I can see myself in those memories, but it didn't last very long because I was also able at that point, the emotion attached to it wasn't actually that strong. It wasn't overwhelming. And so I was actually able to tell myself, I know that you're doing this right now. This is going to make me tear up. But I was able to tell myself, I know that I'm doing this right now, but I'm safe here.
Yeah.
And even if something comes up that does feel unsafe, I have some control of that. I can walk away from the conversation. I can ask to put it on hold. I can take care of me in this situation.
Yes.
So, Naomi, it's okay. Like, you can be here. And I was able to come back. And it's incredible to go from A to B.
Oh, yeah.
And so possible.
And possible.
It's not easy. I was told by my therapist, he said this may be the hardest thing that you work through. Because it was so bad at the time.
Yes.
But I was incredibly motivated. I was like, I understand that. This is worth it to me.
Yes. Yes. Oh, there's so much there. Just the ability to be in many places at once.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
It speaks like resilience, right? That's the word that's popping up for me is you're accepting things. Yes, you're, aware of things. Yes, you have a sense, you have a clinical hat that you can put on sometimes. Like you have this, but really like the resilience underneath, the motivation, the worthiness, the compassion. I mean, it's all there too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know it's been some time, but you described also having bulimia, an eating disorder that's about body distortion and usually around or about a way of escape or regaining control that was lost. And I'm curious about your experience of bulimia because you say that, or you've told me in the past, that you experience it as something that was trauma-induced. So very much, again, like all of these layers interwoven for you in your experience. And I'm curious what you would want to add and to unpack or explore what not only having bulimia was like, but how and what you mean by it being trauma-induced.
So bulimia started for me pretty soon after my first husband and I split. And that happened, I had a kind of a succession of about 3 years, not exactly calendar years. It was maybe 15 months in between each or something. But over a 3.5 year span, my dad died, I was divorced, and then my mom died. That was a lot in a very short span of time.
Yes.
And when my ex-husband and I split, I was still very, very much a mess from my dad having died and still struggling with the reality of what did that mean, especially with him and his leadership role as a prophet and all of these things. And what does that do to my belief system? And how do I hold on to my belief system? And so to have that happen so soon after was unfortunate in many ways. The bulimia came out of a place for me of feeling out of control, for sure, and also unlovable, inadequate, just not enough or too much, something negative. And yeah, feeling very unworthy and lost. And the reason I describe it from a trauma perspective is because it came out of that double trauma of those two losses so close together. And I also say that because, so I was bulimic for about 3.5 years, 4 years, and pretty violently for a while there. I mean, I was pretty rough with myself. And I finally thought, okay, because I never liked it either, which is not super uncommon for people not to like their coping mechanisms. And I took having a master's in social work already, that was completed. So I had access to all the continuing education courses. And so this cracks me up, but it's just totally something I do. If I want to learn about something, I will go get certified in it, or I will, this is why I'm about to have 2 master's degrees and who knows what else I'll get. But I took a continuing education class on trauma-induced eating disorders, and I then treated myself and wasn't bulimic anymore. So it was a very effective course. I wish I could remember what it was called now. It was excellent.
Speaking of resilience.
So, but the other thing is, I didn't actually want to come out and publicly be telling people. So I had this secrecy still to not only what my life was, still being a part of the cult group, but also a secrecy to the struggle I was having.
Sure.
And so it was a way, it was assertive in one way, but very passive in another, because I wasn't willing to actually go seek the support that probably could have helped at that time.
Yeah. I was thinking about just, again, how resiliency plays a role, but also shame, right? And how you were like again, in multiple places with yourself of, I know what I'm doing and I don't like that I'm doing it. I know I'm coping and I don't love my coping strategy, but I want to change it, but I don't want to share it. I don't want to express it. I don't want to shine a light on it. So resourcefulness, resiliency, yes, but also still a lens of unworthiness and shame that I have to do this myself. I have to fix it. And I can't burden anybody else with this task. It has to be quiet and passive, as you say. And that's part of your journey, right? I think that's an important thing to highlight, that some of the work was happening and some of the work was like kind of getting highlighted and still being scared. Yeah.
It's also very true that these negative coping mechanisms that I had, these less than ideal coping mechanisms that I've had at times, they served me for a while.
Right.
And I could have had better ones to begin with, in theory, and that would have been preferable. But they did serve something for a time. And when I was able, I needed to trade them out for something else. And I think people can see a coping mechanism as bad and think, I just need to get rid of this or I need to end it. And we have to consider what it's doing for us and what it's providing, what it's serving while it's hurting. It is still serving something while it's hurting us. And the kindness and the success is found in replacing it with something else. And I needed to be able to do that.
Right. But that there's a journey there. And the function of the behavior matters more than, what is it doing for me, in the sense of what is it protecting me with and from? Because perhaps it's not, like you say, the most ideal coping strategy, but it's keeping me safe. Or it's what I have available to give or to receive right now. It's my best. And so that gentleness, that compassion, like I'm doing the best I can with what I'm going through. Yeah. I have good tingles. So I think it would be important to obviously talk about the grief component of your experience. Losing both of your parents in your 20s, such a pivotal trauma, fairly back to back for you. And so this makes it a complicated grief. I guess want to highlight the difference between grief and complicated grief because they're not the same. Grief is a universal, adapted experience for any human. We go through a natural process of grief. And for a lot of people, they know the 5 stages of grief or know something about them. So it's a normal process to first be in shock or in denial, and then to be angry or depressed, to bargain, and then to accept. And to go through that process, not in any sort of order, usually out of order. But that's normal and natural and universal. But a complicated grief says, I'm experiencing that natural process, but it's complicated by something else that needs attention. The bereavement is complicated because it's attached to trauma, or it's attached to a mental health disorder, or attached to multiple things. And I'm curious about how losing your parents influenced your experience of trauma and healing.
Oh, that's a big question. Losing my parents was the trauma and the need for healing, or at least losing them was the catalyst for it, because the death of them both pulled a very significant string in my woven worldview blanket.
Yes.
And so with my dad, that was fun, so that the belief system stood, so that could withstand. When I lost my mom, I I believed that it must be her time. I felt very accepting in a way, but looking back now, I can see it was more I was accepting my lack of control. I wasn't actually accepting what happened.
Sure.
And there's a big difference between those two things.
Yes.
And so ultimately, the loss of them both is what led me to leave the state, leave actually where I was. I very strongly felt that I needed a change of scenery. And I knew as well the difference between running away, and again, as a highly educated person at that point. So I was like, and there are times where I would advocate for someone to run away for a while. I think there are times where that can be really damn healthy.
Yeah.
But I knew that what I was leaving was coming with me, but I still just needed a change of scenery. I needed to be able to clear my head. And even to this day, if I'm working a lot or whatever, a weekend away just kind of clears my head and gets rid of the cobwebs, and just it's so effective for me. So I knew that I was taking that with me, but I needed some space. And it was in that space that I started to be able to think for myself and ask questions that I had been afraid to ask.
Yeah.
There was no denying that what we had been taught had been proven untrue.
From a logical point of view.
From a logical point of view. And so what was I going to do with that? So the trauma was the loss of them at that time, as far as, okay, now I'm going to take a look at my worldview and what do I do with it? Once I realized what the truth was, my whole upbringing became the trauma.
Yeah.
Which was a really interesting shift that didn't remove the trauma of the loss of them. I loved them. But a lot of other things became traumas that were not.
Yes, because the worldview shifted.
Mm-hmm. And so suddenly the whole group was a trauma. Different nuances of how I had been raised were now traumas because they should not have been that way, whereas I had been taught that they were good for this and this reason. They actually were not. The secrecy I lived in was a trauma. That was a very difficult one to break, that I just fully broke, when we launched this ministry. So the traumas have shifted, and I find that on an intellectual perspective, I find that to be really fascinating, because we can have a trauma that is a catalyst to then discovering that there is something else to uncover. And the beauty in it that I see is that I found out. And for me, any experience of trauma, when I know that it gives me the opportunity to heal. So uncovering a trauma, experiencing a trauma, and I'm talking, of course, right now more about past traumas, uncovering something from the past or being willing to open something back up from the past. It's a possibility and it's an opportunity. And I really, truly see it that way. I see it as a gift. So when something else comes to light, I had something come to light just this past week in part 4 of my story, which will have dropped before this. And in that one, I share that I still struggle to emotionally connect during intimacy with my husband. And it can carry over to friendships as well. I don't know that I ever really go all the way in a friendship. I don't know that there's something about sex with my husband where there's a block there for the emotional connection, the emotional intimacy. And so that came to light for me in a conversation where something really resonated. I'm like, wow, I feel encouraged that I know that now.
Right.
I feel excited talking about it right now because I now know that there are people out there and there are resources out there, and I have a very loving husband who is totally down for a conversation. And I know right now, even though I haven't even gone anywhere further in that journey yet, I know that this is temporary. I know that it's going to be different, and I'm so excited about that. And so I have something to look forward to. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my relationship with my husband's going to get so much deeper. My relationships with those important people in my life, they're going to be able to get so much deeper. There's going to be more richness to my life. That's exciting. I'm thankful for that opportunity.
Wow. Yes. And, a great point just all around is that it doesn't end. Mm-hmm. We always journey towards something more. And that's such a hopeful message. We're never done, but that's beautiful and actually freeing to never be done, because there's something exciting that I can improve, or there's something more I can know. And that is a beautiful gift.
And it does take time.
Yeah.
I can be excited to step forward and embrace it, but I know it's going to take what it's going to take.
Yeah.
I know I have the willingness, but it's going to take what it's going to take. So you're right, knowing, well, then there will be something else and something else. And I don't find that burdensome. I agree with you. It's a relief because there isn't an end point I have to get to. I get to just be present with it as it comes.
Yes. And taking perfectionism off the table is a weight lifted for almost everyone that I know, including myself. If perfectionism isn't possible, then that's so freeing to just be, to be present, to grow, to fail and mess up and try again, because that's what makes life.
Thank you for listening to this production of Naomi Wright Ministries. You can learn more about us by visiting naomiwrightministries.com. Please note that any opinions represented by this ministry are not to be mistaken as medical or professional counseling advice or services. Employees, volunteers, representatives, guests of Naomi Wright Ministries may be individually trained, authorized, or licensed to provide professional counseling, psychological treatment, or psychological diagnoses. What you are listening to or viewing is not the provision of any such services. None of the interviews represented here creates a counselor-counselee relationship.